The hearing will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the Budget Committee Members' Day hearing on oversight of the Congressional Budget Office. Before we begin, I'd ask unanimous consent that, consistent with Clause 4 of House Rule 16, the Chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time. Without objection, the request is agreed to. While CBO was established by the Congressional Budget Impoundment Act of 1974, the agency has not undergone a comprehensive review since its founding more than 40 years ago. CBO's mission has remained the same over the years, but expectations have clearly changed and evolved over time. So these hearings in the House Budget Committee are intended to help us learn more about how CBO carries out its nonpartisan mandate, to consider potential areas for improvement, and to ensure the agency has everything it needs to fulfill its mission. We started this series of hearings discussing the agency's organizational and operational structure with CBO Director Dr. Keith Hall. In our second hearing, we began to explore some of the more technical aspects of how they work in crafting an impartial work product to Congress that relies on the CBO to make informed legislative decisions. And last week, we took an even deeper dive into CBO's use of models as a tool in scoring legislative proposals and what kinds of assumptions are made in that process. Today will be a little different than the previous discussions. We're providing interested members of the House the opportunity to be part of the ongoing conversation about CBO's mission, work product, and transparency efforts. Members who do not serve on this committee engage with CBO in different ways and can present additional perspectives on the challenges they have experienced in working with CBO and possible improvements on how the agency supports Congress. CBO is necessary for a successful and fully functioning budget process, so we do not take light of any of these conversations. I look forward to considering ideas brought by members of the House and continuing to identify potential areas of improvement at the agency. Thank you, and with that, I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing. I'm pleased to join you in welcoming our witnesses for Members' Day, our fourth CBO oversight hearing. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 created CBO. For more than 40 years, as you mentioned, CBO, a nonpartisan agency, has provided Congress with objective and impartial information about budgetary and economic issues. The agency assists Congress by developing our nation's fiscal and economic outlook, which helps us understand where we are and where we are going in terms of deficits and debt under current law. CBO also provides cost estimates for legislation being considered by Congress, which are extremely important in detailing a bill's potential impact and its effects on deficits. CBO has never claimed, nor has it ever been expected, to perfectly predict the future. If the staff could, I'm sure they would be in a much more profitable line of work. However, CBO and its experienced nonpartisan analysts do provide their best estimates possible within the time and resource constraints that Congress gives them. Nevertheless, CBO has recently been the target of harsh and sometimes unjust attacks. We may hear some of those criticisms today, but I hope the fact that just a handful of members are testifying at this hearing is an indication that cooler heads are prevailing. To be fair, Congress has a duty to review CBO's work and ask questions about economic assumptions and methodologies used, and CBO should do its best to provide Congress with explanations for that work, as they've done over the last few hearings. Democrats have certainly raised questions about CBO's assumptions in the past, and I'm sure we will in the future. However, we Democrats and Republicans have not been given any reason, in my opinion, to question the integrity of CBO or its analysts. In the 3 CBO oversight hearings we've already held this year, we've heard nothing that should lead anyone to doubt the character of CBO staff or the soundness of their work. So I hope and expect that members giving testimony today will focus on appropriate areas for oversight and will not sink to the level of making ad hominem attacks on CBO staffers or questioning the integrity or political impartiality of the institution. CBO tells Congress what we need to know, regardless of whether or not it's what we want to hear. That is invaluable. So, Mr. Chairman, I will not take any more time. I look forward to hearing from what our colleagues have to add to this conversation today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member. As a reminder, members have 5 minutes to give their oral testimony. Their written statements will be submitted for the record. Additionally, the majority and minority will each be given 5 minutes per side for members to question each witness following their statement. I'd now like to recognize our first witness, Representative Warren Davidson from the Buckeye State. Thank you for taking time to share your views with the Budget Committee. The committee has received your written statement. It will be part of the formal hearing record, and you'll have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks, give or take, given our short turnout here today. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Representative Davison.
Chairman, thank you, and to the committee, thank you for taking up this time in your committee's schedule to hear from other members, and I appreciate your interest in the CBO Show Your Work Act, H.R. 3822. This is a bill that deals not with pejorative accusations or ad hominem attacks on CBO. It simply says, whatever you're doing, please show your work. It could be PhD level algorithms or a magic 8-ball, but whatever they do, they could show it to the world. The goal is to strengthen the transparency and therefore accountability, and in the long run accuracy, because they would benefit from the same sorts of open source methods that are popularized throughout the for-profit economy. Before coming to Congress, I was a manufacturer. Whenever our company was deciding how to price for a quote or a new product line or how to value an acquisition, I always worked closely with our CFO and our cost accountants. Our interactions were iterative as we worked to model the critical decisions that shaped our companies. At times, a quick summary report, a chart, graph, or simple email was sufficient, but I could always get as much detail as needed to understand how the costs stacked up so that I could accurately assess how the various alternative courses of action could influence the desired outcome. This open and transparent relationship helped my executive team communicate effectively and my businesses run more efficiently. I was able to execute transactions knowing I had the best data. No section or department within the business held the other hostage. Congress, and indeed the American people, need the same relationship with CBO. CBO has the vital role as our accounting department in Congress. Given the enormous weight CBO scores have on the ability of members of Congress to make policy decisions, it should be a top priority for CBO standards and scores to be transparent, accurate, and of the highest possible quality. Requiring CBO to release how it scores legislation for informational purposes can help lawmakers fairly judge these bills effectively and accurately model alternative courses of action. I didn't have to guess in business, and when the stakes are even higher here in Congress, we shouldn't hope, we should know. For that reason, last September, I introduced H.R. 3822, the CBO Show Your Work Act. The bill does 3 things. First, it requires the CBO to publish all data, models, and processes utilized in the analysis and scoring of legislation online. Next, it specifies that the data and information provided must be sufficient so that individuals outside of CBO can understand, replicate, and reproduce the results found within CBO scores. Finally, should CBO not disclose certain data sets due to privacy, they must instead publish a complete list of data variables for that data. This would give users of the model an opportunity to modify inputs using aggregates based on private details kept at CBO. So, for example, you could have the sum but not the individual components, say of tax returns or prescription drug costs. Data such as these descriptive statistics, averages, standard deviations, or correlations could include reference to the statute or rule preventing their disclosure. In considering this bill, it's important to remember that academic institutions around the world already do this. Economists understand that transparency and openness of communication provides a strong safeguard against errors, omissions, and bias. This is why the academic community increasingly requires scholars and economists to show their work before publishing, to ensure the integrity is upheld of the published work. In one example, the American Economic Association data availability policy reads, quote, "It is the policy of the American Economic Association to publish papers only if the data used in the analysis are clearly and precisely documented and are readily available to any researcher for purposes of replication." In light of most recent glaring need for transparency concerning the increasingly contentious healthcare and tax reform debates, it's vitally important that CBO adopts this widely accepted and acknowledged data availability standard so that members can do our job. and that we have access to our accounting department, and we have access to expertise that may not even be available on Capitol Hill. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Representative Davidson. Again, pursuant to the rules of the committee hearing, 5 minutes each side for questions. I'll yield to the ranking member.
I have no questions, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any questions on the majority side? Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Davidson, I was struck by what the ranking member said, that here is an important issue. We all talk about CBO a great deal, yet only 3 members have come forward to try to make a difference in that. I think that is partly because of a confidence that we all like to have in the men and women who work with us in service. I think part of it is because it is so complex. When you talk about replicating the CBO's work, I believe, as we've had some hearings, Mr. Chairman, folks have said, you know what, we really can't be a check and a balance on CBO because we don't have their model, we don't have their capability, we can't go back and replicate it. On the one hand, I would imagine that if we could replicate CBO's work, there might be more gaming of the system. You and I would sit down with CBO's model and we would work our bill out so that it came back with a favorable score based on that model. I guess my question is, when I go to the private sector and look at some of the big macroeconomic modeling houses, they tell me that their formula is the most proprietary thing that they have. They want to keep that a secret. In fact, we had a bill about Wall Street the other day where stock pickers wanted to keep their formulas for picking stocks a secret in that way. Given your experience in the private sector, you would distinguish the work that CBO does and its need for public transparency from the work that all of those private sector groups do and their desire for secrecy.
Absolutely. So if you think about a trading firm, they're literally rewriting code all day to get the right algorithm to trade. If you think about Google, they're writing stuff all day to get search results. If you're looking at people that do this, they have proprietary information. In this case, the information is the American people's information. This is our accounting department, and their formulas shouldn't be proprietary. So if you think about a spreadsheet or a pivot table that they're looking at, there may be proprietary information that's contained on other sheets, but the top level data, the formula that says this is how how many people are affected by this change of policy. Well, that's an equation of some sorts. There's math behind it normally, and so we should be able to say, gee, what are the variables that are driving that? If you think about a company like GE, they're undergoing some restructuring. I would assume the board of directors right now is asking lots of questions about the cost accounting in these various divisions of the company, saying, how are we going to save our company? And I am confident they're not being told by their accounting department, well, we can't really share that with you. And essentially, we are here trying to steer the course of fiscal policy for the United States economy, far more consequential than any one company. And we're doing it blindly, frankly. We just throw stuff in and go, well, gee, I hope this gets a good score. And then how dare you question the integrity of the accounting department? Well, gee, what'd you base your assumption on? I mean, could you show me? Maybe I would understand why, if I make this recommendation, we're getting the outcome here. And it may be that you're exactly right, but then legislators could write effective legislation and not be shooting in the dark.
You would anticipate, if your bill became law, that I would be able to grab some group of data or a program or something and take it down to Georgia State University, and we would be able to run the same model with the same variables on the same formula and come out with the same outcome. When you talk about show your work, you mean we really ought to be able to replicate the work that today goes on behind closed doors.
Right, it should be reproducible, just the same as the standard for academic research, and same when you're looking at crowdsourcing a project. If they're looking at open source code, it's available and it's out there. You should be able to put the inputs in, and people would say, gee, what about this idea? You may actually get even better ideas from the great American public and other minds that are focused on other problems.
Well, I agree with Mr. Yarmouth that we ought to be proud of the men and women who serve us in all the different ways that they do. And I would wonder if anyone would have an objection to being able to replicate that work, because whatever cloud of suspicion hangs over that work today, your idea would dispel that cloud forever, and I'm grateful to you for it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, given the fact that we have 5 minutes each side, I'd seek unanimous consent to extend the time just a little bit longer, because we do have a couple of more members that had a question, and without objection, we'll do that. Just be mindful of the fact that we are supposed to be on the clock. Mr. Ferguson.
Deal. Mr. Davidson, thank you so much, and you too, Mr. Perry. Glad y'all are here. One of the concerns that I've had, or one of the questions that I've had, and just keep going back to, is looking at the accuracy of the data within a 10-year window. Go and pick any year in which you have a CBO score, and then extrapolate out 10 years, and what's the accuracy of that data at that 10-year window. What we have found, what we've been told by CBO, is that they are 97%, I think, accurate within 6 years. But they do not have any data to support years 7, 8, 9, and 10. And we're being asked to make long-term decisions on data which we have no idea what the accuracy of that data or the likelihood of those things coming true is at the 10-year mark. Would you ever, in your business models, look at, try to look 10 years out and say, well, we really have no idea what that could actually look like and cost our company? And do you have any suggestions about, what you would do with that, with that lack of certainty in the outlying years as we make really critical decisions based on data that's unclear what the long-term outlook is?
Yeah, I think, rearward looking is a little easier than forward looking, right? So when you look back on anything, it's hard to know exactly how things are going to turn out in 6 to 10 years, or sometimes 6 to 10 months. But you can look at what the assumptions were and why you drew that conclusion if you have access to the models. And so that's my hope, is that we would get more accurate models if there was transparency. And as Mr. Woodall stated, it would be the surest remedy to all the partisan accusations that, well, this is biased because of this assumptions. Look, it's math. Here's the formula. This is the assumptions. And if you disagree, then at least you would know why. So it may be that some people, for example, in tax modeling, the whole debate about how much revenue does the government collect comes down to what your assumption on the growth rate is. Well, what's driving the assumptions on that? I think a lot of us looked at the CBO report and talked to some outside people that had more optimistic assumptions than CBO did. But we didn't have the model to go off of. We just had people hoping that they were accurate. We could look at outside models and say why their assumptions were what they were, but we couldn't and still haven't been able to look at what CBO's model was.
All right. Ms. Black, Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Davidson, for being here. I, like you, would like to see the information and how they got to where they got to. And I think when you're in a business, at least my experience in business, it's a lot easier to be able to make some of those assumptions that are being made, because it really is just about numbers in many of those cases. The thing that I think is so difficult, and I wanted to ask you if you have a recommendation or if you've looked at other models that do a better job with this, are the behavioral assumptions. That's been my biggest complaint with CBO, is they make an assumption on how someone is going to behave. We saw that particularly in the case of the Affordable Care Act. If you do this, then we think people are going to react this way and do that. I don't know that there's a good model out there. Do you know? Is there a good model out there? Is there some other scoring agency that you've looked at where you said, I really like that behavioral assumption model, and I think they do a really good job on that?
Yes, I think if you look at, say, for example, a large retail store like Walmart, how do they run their inventory? How is it that they know that if the storm models predict this, we should stock these items on their shelf? They've got great data. They'll have reasonably accurate projections off, how many Pop-Tarts they're going to sell in a storm versus how many Pop-Tarts they're going to sell in good weather, and when they need to have stock. So they understand that because it's the specifics of their business, but they really look at it differently by different regions. And so I'm not saying that we can use their exact model to drop in on health insurance, but they are very familiar with their model. CBO may very well be incredibly familiar with our model, but as the people making the decisions, it's guarded, it's veiled. We still don't know why they assume that no matter what we do, the same number of people lose coverage on the health care plan. That'd be nice to see the model, and then we could see, well, I don't know, I model different behavior. Now you can say, I believe there's different behavior than the CBO believes, but that's all qualitative. What we'd like to be able to do is make it quantitative with a real model.
Have you seen any other models out there that you could point to say, this particular model got things right, got it closer? Because I've not seen any of that.
Well, at the macroeconomic level, I mean, economists exist to make weathermen look accurate, right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, thank you. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Yarmouth.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. In another day, we're going to start a process. Mr. Woodall is part of it. Chairman Womack and I are part of it. A bicameral, bipartisan effort to analyze the budgeting and appropriations process and see if there are solutions we can come up to whatever problems we perceive. And I would think that your proposal would be something that this group might want to consider. My question about it is, and part of it relates to what former Chairman Black mentioned, but when you listen to CBO here, and we've had 3 hearings, and they've spent a lot of time talking about the components of their analysis. And when you listen to them, it actually seems like there is more subjective, artistic modeling than there is actual data. And so much of it has to do with human behavior. We know that, for instance, with the ACA, all the anticipation was that a lot of companies would decide it was in their economic interest to pay the $2,000 per employee rather than continuing to provide coverage, and very few companies did that because they made the judgment that it was more important to retain their workers, to treat their workers well, their employees well, and that's something that no model, I think, could have anticipated. And in fact, I don't think any outside analysis of the ACA anticipated that so few companies would actually make that decision. So that's one point I want to make, but my question to you is, if we were to have all this information, knowing Congress as I think I do in my 12th year, what do you think Congress would make of it if they had all of this information? And what would be the repercussions if you or 10 members or 50 members came and said, we're convinced that this modeling was wrong, that this process was wrong, this methodology was wrong? What would be the repercussions of that if we had your suggestions in place?
Well, I think, so you make the point that how much of it is qualitative versus quantitative, and I think that's one of the concerns, frankly, that we rely a lot on qualitative data, and you've got companies out there in the private sector where, quant folks, high caliber math folks, are some of the highest demand. I mean, you have PhDs in math signing for $1 million initial jobs because math is so important to their business. They're not hoping on some qualitative assumptions. They're building great data sets and using math. I'm not saying CBO can pay those, but it may be, we have companies making $1 million decisions with better support than we're making $1 trillion decisions. And if it were working really well, I suppose I wouldn't be as concerned, but if you just back in and macro, take all the politics away, look at the math, think of all the assumptions we have to have going for us to believe that we're somehow going to collect $1 trillion extra revenue. Because we're borrowing $1 trillion. We assume, I assume some people that vote for this stuff believe that in the long run we're going to be able to afford it. If you're just doing qualitative decisions, maybe it's okay to keep doing that. We've got to get more quant in our accounting department. And if they do have it, I think that making it public might even drive behavior where it becomes common for members of Congress to have a quant person in their office. I would be looking at that. I mean, I had one of the most important hires that we had in our company was cost accounting, because we were pricing stuff. The fate of the company hangs out sometimes on a tenth of a penny. in terms of pricing it. You can't guess at that. You have to be, you know, quantitatively accurate. And I think sometimes when we're modeling these things, they're incredibly consequential for the entire economy in the United States, but have really big impact on the global economy. And so I really believe that we are way behind what is happening in the private sector with respect to quantitative data.
Well, you didn't answer the one question I had was, if Congress had all this data, and you have a number of members who say, oh, this is wrong, they shouldn't have done it this way, what happens at that point?
Well, this is common in a business as well. You know, you'll have, you know, this person might believe that, no, this is the right course of action, but they're supporting it with data. And generally, some people are persuaded more by emotion and qualitative reasoning, and that might be the right answer sometimes. But facts matter. They're stubborn. And when you have quantitative data and it's supported by, you know, sound logic and math, a lot of people are persuaded by that. Now, we would have our debate. We would still have our privileges as member of Congress. We would make our arguments. But I think we would have the supporting documents. And then, you know, as is the case, we would probably have Brookings look at the data and believe that it's this way, and have Heritage look at it and it's that way. It may still have the same kinds of debates, but I think the quality of our debate would be better because it would be based on mathematical models more and more frequently, and we would get more and more accurate, just as we've seen the private sector do.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, may I just ask if you would yield on just the end of that question, because it was a very interesting question. Representative Davison, what would then happen at the end of the day? Because you would obviously have a number of people say, I think it's more the way Brookings, or I think it's more this one or that one, whichever one you choose. But at the end of the day, would we still use CBO as what we would use
Well, my bill
as a
doesn't-
Congress?
Thank you. And so my bill doesn't say whether we should or shouldn't have CBO. I think it'd be hard to imagine not operating with some kind of accounting department. So I think we should have someone. Exactly what the org chart should look like, I'll leave that to those of you who've been spending a lot of time working with them. I'm just looking at it and saying, even if we had the debate, as Mr. Yarmouth laid out, at the end of the day, we would make a decision, whether it was based off of qualitative data or quantitative data or this person's model or that one. We would decide. And then as Mr. Ferguson pointed out, over time, we would see the results, and we would know who was accurate. I mean, we're in the early stages of that experiment today. It was, you know, 5-alarm fire, Armageddon, crumbs on the tax plan, and over the course of the next year or 2 or 5, we will see whether it really is going to have a stimulative effect on the economy, and people are really going to get more take-home pay, as has been the case, or whether it's really just a rip-off of the middle class. People are already starting to see that in their paychecks. We made the decision based off of something, but time will tell. And I think that's going to continue to be the case, even if we do have the back and forth between a higher level of data.
Thank you. I just think the ranking member brought up something I hadn't thought about. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Good, healthy discussion. Thank you, Representative Davison, for your comments and your desire to seek improvement in our process and your willingness to take questions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman.
I'd like to now recognize our next witness, Representative General Scott Perry from the Keystone State. Representative Perry.
Well, thank you. Let me begin by offering my appreciation to you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Womack, and Ranking Member Yarmouth for this. This is a grand opportunity for any citizen to speak before the Budget Committee. Members of Congress and the American people should be able to rely on the fiscal analysis of all legislation as accurate. However, the fiscal analysis provided by the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, is consistently incorrect and has numerous detrimental policy implications on a variety of policy over the years. Most recently, the CBO came under renewed criticism as Congress continued its push to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, in 2017. In 2010, the CBO projected that 21 million people would enroll in the exchange plans by 2016. The actual 2016 enrollment was 10.4 million. They missed the mark by over 50%. And I would just encourage you, if that was your mutual fund manager, I suspect you would have some questions about accountability there. Additionally, in 2016, the CBO projected 22 million Americans would lose health insurance under the House Republican replacement proposal for the Affordable Care Act, while ignoring the fact that 19 million people either paid the penalty or claimed an exemption from the individual mandate. Now, I just wonder, and it's not to impugn the organization or any of the individuals in it. I'm sure that they're working hard and diligently and believe in their mission as they should. But I wonder, and I don't know, nor do any of us, if that was formulaic or if they literally disregard what's happening in reality, as opposed to some formula that says, at this point, we should be at this number, and so that's our starting point. And you say, well, but yeah, I understand that's the formula maybe, but the reality is that never happens, so you should base your assessment on reality. Yet they do not. Another example that comes to mind is from 2015, when Congress authorized the Federal Communications Commission to auction off portions of the electromagnetic spectrum by voluntarily asking public broadcasters to surrender unused space to mobile data providers, including cell phone companies. This auction generated over $40 billion in revenue for the federal government, yet the CBO score indicated that this would yield no revenues to the federal government. Ladies and gentlemen, nations go to war on imperfect information, and the decisions that we make here impact people's lives very closely, very intimately. And my interest is seeking the most accurate, the most correct information so that we can precede that. That is my only motivation here. But even worse than incorrect outcomes themselves is the lack of transparency of the process that Mr. Davison discussed. We have no idea why these projections were so inaccurate. And if you don't have any idea why they're wrong, you have no way of correcting this course. And so we continue to score legislation and make decisions based on what we don't have any confidence in. I just think that's foolish. We don't live our lives that way. Why would we as a representative of the American people, make decisions for them on that behalf the same way? To me, we face four critical problems with CBO scoring, which must be addressed to ensure the accuracy of projections in the future. Number one, Keynesian assumptions. Since its inception, CBO's economic models have been based on assumptions that more government spending nearly always yields faster economic growth, the so-called Keynesian multiplier. Unfortunately, these Keynesian economic policies, in many people's opinion, and I know some others, but in my opinion, have failed in reality, in real life. On the other side of the same coin, the CBO underestimates the benefits of market forces in reforming government programs. Number two, lack of transparency. To add to this difficulty, the formulas the CBO uses are not public, and they can't even be evaluated independently. Maybe Congress shouldn't evaluate them. I'm not an economist, but my goodness, somebody should evaluate them. And after 40 years, we don't even know if they've modernized. I have no idea if they've modernized. This seems archaic to me. Baseline budgeting. The use of baseline budgeting is flawed and often construes government spending increases as a given prior to the appropriations process. This results in a distorted view of what is or isn't a funding cut. If the funding is off base on the assumed but not authorized or appropriated funding level, any reduction from the assumption becomes a cut. This is a misnomer and unfairly strikes fear in the hearts of vulnerable populations, our seniors, and our military, while simultaneously encouraging more unfunded spending or underfunded spending. And that only happens in Washington, D.C. You know, if I go to the store and I say to my wife, I'm going to spend $100, and that's my plan, but I come home and I say, well, I only spent $85, she's not going to be mad at me and say, well, you cut the grocery spending. She's going to say, well, good for you. You didn't spend as much. That's not necessarily a cut, you know, if it's the same 100 that you spent the week before. With your indulgence, Mr. Chair, one more point. Even worse, we don't have a metric to determine the efficacy of the CBO. There is no empirical data to show congressional decisions making has improved as a result of the CBO. However, it is safe to say Fiscal responsibility has significantly decreased in the time since its establishment. While I completely respect the impartiality of the office, I have deep concerns that this process is flawed, as demonstrated by the examples I've listed. This has directly limited our ability to address the pressing issues facing the American people, and we need transparency in the process. And again, I thank you for your indulgence.
You bet. Thank you, Representative Perry. Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Congressman Perry, for your testimony. I'm curious, have you ever met with CBO?
Well, as a rank and file member, every time that I seek to get something from the CBO, it has to go through a chairman, and the CBO is always happy to tell me that. So, unfortunately, no, I don't have many opportunities to meet with the CBO staff.
Well, when they were here over these last 3 hearings, they stressed that they are more than happy to meet with members to talk about how they analyze data and issues and so forth. So I would recommend that you avail yourself of that opportunity. And also, I suspect that maybe if they see your testimony, they'd be interested in responding to it, which, I think is probably
I'm happy to have the dialogue.
a good idea. What's interesting to me is, and clearly when we passed the ACA, when CBO scored the ACA, we were talking about something that affects somewhere around 16 to 18% of the economy, 300 plus million people, and it was going to be an exercise that was fraught with complexity and with so many variables that any kind of analysis of either economic or otherwise was going to be fairly difficult to make. So you mentioned that, and you mentioned the auction, and I don't know if there are any other examples that you want to provide, but when the CBO has been here for 3 hearings, basically all that's come up is the ACA. And if, granted that was a major piece of legislation, but if those are the only examples that somebody can pull out of 40 years of CBO performance when they got something significantly wrong, that's a pretty good track record, I would think. And when you're talking about the auction, you're talking about trying to predict something that probably the fastest moving segment of civilization was going to be difficult, to say the least. But also, if I'm not mistaken, CBO's projection of the auction impact was no different than anybody else's. Virtually everyone thought that it wasn't going to be as successful as it turned out to be. So that I just raised those points. I would love to hear more because, again, the CBO is constantly reviewing its record, and as I said, they have gotten it right far more than they have gotten it wrong. And I just raised those points. With regard to the ACA, one of the things that I think is important to remember is that there were a lot of things that happened that were not part of the original legislation. So when you had, under the original legislation, every state had to opt into the Medicaid expansion. Supreme Court changed that in 2012, which changed a lot in terms of the impact. And CBO continually changed their forecasts because of that. The other point I would mention, and maybe this is something that, and I've raised this in hearings before with CBO, I've asked them, well, since everything you're doing is somewhat imprecise by nature, what about giving a range that would maybe be more helpful? And unfortunately, Congress prescribes to them that they have to come up with an exact number. And so maybe that's something that we would want to consider changing, because the CBO is subject to the rules that we set up for them. So anyway, with all that, I didn't really have a question except the first one, and I would again recommend that you take the opportunity to go meet with CBO and discuss some of your concerns with them, because you may not be satisfied, and when I discuss some of my concerns, I'm not always satisfied either. But that's all I have.
If I may respond,
Sure.
Like I said, I'm happy to have the dialogue. We limited the examples to 2 in the interest of time, which I still failed to be successful at, but we will endeavor to get you more information. I would just offer this, even though I haven't put it into legislative language, I have offered in public that I thought maybe a new model, or at least a competing model, and I offered something like where we pick the Democrat side, because this is inherently partisan like everything else, would pick a firm to do the modeling and the assessments and the estimates, and the Republicans pick one, and then we both agree on some independent one. We do an RFP for 10 years or something like that, and whoever is least accurate drops off, and we rebid that and continue a drive towards more and more accuracy so that we can go forward in these decisions with more complete information. And like I said, I haven't put that into legislative language, but in my opinion, what we have now is not working adequately.
Thank you for your comments and your testimony. I appreciate that. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member. Mr. Grothman.
You bring up something that I, quite frankly, wasn't aware of, but in all their estimates, they buy into this Keynesian Holcomb. Is that true?
That's the information that I have, that was originally established. That's where it's weighted, and I'm a person who does not believe wholly or even marginally in Keynesian economic theory, and I know that there's always arguments among economists and would-be economists and just your average citizen, but I think that to get an accurate assessment, we ought to look at both sides of that equation, not to have it tilted towards the Keynesian economic model.
I think it's largely discredited. I mean, I thought it was kind of embarrassing that I was given Keynesian economics when I went to the University of Wisconsin 40 years ago. I always thought it was a stain on the UW. Do you think there's any way we can make sure we hire some more open-minded people? Do you ever talk to them? Do they acknowledge that they buy into this Keynesian stuff?
Like I said, as a rank and file member, every time that we try and get something scored from the CBO or what have you, it has to go through your committee chairman and so on and so forth, and you're frustrated. And so I haven't had that conversation about how they hire, or if you have to have a Keynesian economic belief in your education and your assessments. I don't know that to be true, but and I suspect actually that it's not. But if that's how the modeling is skewed, I think that's important for all of us to know, because we make our decisions oftentimes based on these estimates and the budget window and so on and so forth. And I think it really hampers our ability to come up with good policy that is long-lasting and visionary. And our adversaries, whether they be China or even someone like Russia, they're not hampered by these decisions. They have a different governing model, and I accept that. But I think that we are limiting ourselves willingly and willfully, and it's unnecessary. And so that again would be my position.
That'll be enough.
Any other questions? Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Perry, I think sometimes we treat the CBO like we treat the IRS. We don't like what it's doing, but the truth is it's doing what we told it to do. I carry the baseline budgeting bill with Louis Gohmert, and Congress told CBO, you've got to do it this way. It's very strange to me. It's the only CBO was created to be an adjunct of budget committee staff. We're not going to have an appropriations hearing where the appropriations staff director dictates to the chairman how it's going to be. We're not going to have an energy and commerce hearing where the energy and commerce staff director dictates to the members how it's going to be. But in the absence of us setting it up in statute, while Mr. Yarmouth would be a very capable chairman next cycle, I hope Mr. Womack is a very capable chairman next cycle. The alternative to us setting it in statute is to leave it in the discretion of committee chairman to direct the CBO, knowing that you speak for the frustrations of a lot of members. Would you be more comfortable if it wasn't statutory guidance, if it was committee leadership guidance, or which do you believe protects your interests more?
Well, of course, the caveat is as leadership changes and viewpoints change, if it's left to committee leadership, so goes the assessment. But I think that as a small government guy, I feel like legislation becomes overwhelming to change and ultimately limiting, as this has over the span of 40 or so years, and doesn't keep up with the time. So I think I'd be willing, if that were my options, to roll the dice, and we're all accountable at some point. And if the chair chooses a course that is ineffective, I think that there would be some level of accountability based on the failure or success of that policy decision. I can live with that. That's how our government's supposed to work.
That is valuable to hear. Thank you, Mr. Perry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions? Mr. Perry, we thank you for your comments and your willingness to take questions. Thank you for your
And I
appearance
thank you
here
so much
this
for the
morning.
opportunity.
All right. See, Dr. Burgess, it's good to have you here today. Like recognize our next witness, Representative Dr. Michael Burgess from Texas. You'll have 5 minutes, and then we'll give each side an opportunity to engage in Q&A with you. Floor is yours, sir.
In our Committee on Energy and Commerce, we sometimes swear witnesses in. You're not going to do that today?
No, we only swear at them.
All right. Well, I appreciate you letting me be here today and talk about what I think is an important
Mike, talk right into that mic, if you would, please.
There, is that bit, whoa. So the Congressional Budget
Back
Office.
away from that mic just a little
And
bit.
we, as we're all aware, the Congressional Budget Office does dictate to us, but really they should be our partner in things. At least that's my approach. And I will submit my entire testimony for the record, but let me just summarize. In healthcare, we are moving to an era where management of chronic disease becomes as important or perhaps even more important than the management of an acute episode of an illness. And we can all think of examples of that. And here's the problem. Within the budgetary guidelines, within the structure that the Congressional Budget Office works, it works off a 10-year budget window. Now, if you have something that is likely to improve population health over a longer term, the 10-year budget window will reflect only the cost of doing that intervention, whatever it is, but will not account for any of the savings delivered. So this approach is a way to expand the 10-year budget window to perhaps 1 or 2 additional 10-year cycles in order to capture the savings that are available. And the bill is really pretty simple and straightforward in that approach. You do have to have a determination by the director of the Congressional Budget Office that a proposal will result in reductions in budget outlays. That seems pretty simple. If the CBO determines that a measure would result in reductions, then the CBO shall include a description and estimation of the reductions in the budget outlays that it provides to members of Congress. And secondly, it will include the projected savings in the appropriate budgetary out years. So the bill also goes on to define preventive health because, as you might imagine, any time in the budgetary process when you're changing things, there is perhaps still the ability to open the door to unintended consequences. So preventive health is defined in the bill, and that means an action that focuses on the health of the public, individuals, and defined populations in order to protect, promote, and maintain health and wellness. And the budgetary out years phrase is defined as meaning 2 consecutive 10-year periods following the initial 10-year scoring window for a total scoring period of up to 30 years. This bill would in no way remove the authority of this committee or the authority of the authorizing committees in either the House or Senate. This type of activity would have to be brought to the CBO by one of the relevant committees. It's not just something that they can undertake. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know if there's anyone here who was here the night that Medicare Part D passed. That was 2003. And there was a budgetary projection with Medicare Part D. And over the next 10 years, I cannot recall the Congressional Budget Office ever coming back and saying, well, this is what we told you it was going to cost. Here's what it actually did cost. So in 2013 or 2014, perhaps 2015 at the latest, we should have, I think, received that information. And if we had, this is what we might have found if they did take into account preventive scoring. We all talked when the Part D part of Medicare, the Medicare Modernization Act, was passed, that if we treat the diabetes, we will have to pay less for amputations and end-stage renal disease. Well-known clinical fact that tighter glucose control and better management leads to fewer complications, and it is the complications which are so expensive. So I just submit this for your consideration. I see that Ms. Schakowsky is part of your committee here. She is also on the Energy and Commerce Committee. When the Democrats were in the majority and the Affordable Care Act was considered, I can recall very clearly an afternoon where she was incredulous that Mr. Doug Elmendorf, who was then the director of the CBO, would not give our committee credit for any savings that were going to be manifested in all of the great things that were going to happen in the Affordable Care Act. So I will credit Ms. Schakowsky. It was her and Diane DeGette who actually brought this to my attention, and the bill is bipartisan and has bipartisan co-sponsors. So thank you for allowing me to testify, and I'll be happy to take your questions.
Dr. Burgess, we really appreciate your testimony. Mr. Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Burgess. You and I, back when we were debating the Affordable Care Act, had some spirited discussions and arguments, and I think it's accurate to say we don't agree on much, but I totally agree with you.
That is correct.
I totally agree with you on this. It's something we have raised, or I've raised a number of times with CBO, and I'll tell you the answer they give, which is not something that I think is sufficient, but the answer they'll give is that there are so many added balancing costs when people live longer that it's very difficult to make that kind of analysis. Clearly, you know, and I've asked the same question about education. Under current rules and 10-year budget windows, we could not have passed the original GI Bill because all of the economic benefits of those educational payments accrued after a 10-year budget window after World War II. So this is something that we absolutely have to deal with. If we're going to do any kind of long-term thinking in this body, we have to, in some way, figure out how to anticipate long-term implications, budgetary and otherwise. So I thank you for your contribution, and I would hope that in our joint special committee that Mr. Woodall and Chairman Womack and I are a part of, we can address this issue as well. So I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank you for pointing out it's necessary to take the long view sometimes.
Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had never considered, as I've looked at your legislation, Dr. Burgess, the comments that Mr. Yarmouth just made. Would you anticipate that multi-year, that multi-decade analysis showing both the cost savings because you were improving health outcomes as well as cost expenses because folks were remaining on Medicare longer, remaining on Social Security longer? I have always anticipated that it was going to help us provide better funding for preventative diseases, but I can certainly understand how it starts to value a life as opposed to value prevention. How does the legislation anticipate that?
Well, again, I'm going to go back to my discussion on the Medicare Modernization Act, and perhaps some of those questions could be answered by a study. What is the 10-year interval since the passage of the Medicare Modernization Act, or more correctly, its implementation in January of 2006? What does that study show us about what is the behavior of populations managed in this way over a longer period of time? Perhaps we could gain some insights. It's quite possible that, hey, there's no impact, but I don't believe that will be the case. And then in medicine, we talk about a phenomenon known as the compression of morbidities. So you take the statin so you don't have the heart attack at age 48 or 52, but something is eventually going to happen. We all wear out at some point. The object is to keep that person as healthy and useful and engaged in productive activities for as long as possible. Then, when the inevitable end is in sight, there will be a compression of morbidities, and perhaps that timeline will be sufficiently short that it will not bankrupt the budget. Otherwise, as those of us who are fortunate enough to be baby boomers come down the pipe, we are going to cost those that come after us a lot of money.
Well, you are as conservative a member as we have in Congress. So you bring a bipartisan piece of legislation today. It has always struck me that every time you talk about saving money, it's in the name of making people's lives better by preventing bad outcomes as opposed to making their life worse by taking something away. You only want to take away sickness, and I have always been grateful to you for that. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions for the witness? Dr. Burgess, we truly appreciate your appearance before the committee today, and grateful that you've taken time out of your schedule to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you. May I leave some materials for the record? Do you have a record in the committee?
We do, and
All right.
it was part of our opening, so your prepared statement will be made a part of the official record.
All right, thank you very much.
You bet. That completes the committee's business that I see for today. Is there anything left for the good of the order? Not hearing any, I'd like to thank all the members who shared their views before the Budget Committee, and this committee stands adjourned.